Chapter 6. His mood was tranquil and benevolent, but not at all sociable. He wanted his time for thinking, and he did not care to meet any of the people on the ship. Not any of them. Though when he encountered the people with whom he sat at his table, he greeted them pleasantly and smiled. He began to play a role on the ship, that of a serious young man with a serious job ahead of him. He was courteous, poised, civilized, and preoccupied. He had a sudden whim for a cap, and bought one in the haberdashery, a conservative bluish-gray cap of a soft English wool. He could pull its visor down over nearly his whole face when he wanted to nap in his deck chair, or wanted to look as if he were napping. A cap was the most versatile of headgears, he thought. He wondered why he had never thought of wearing one before. He could look like a country gentleman, a thug, an Englishman, a Frenchman, or a plain American eccentric, depending on how he wore it. Tom amused himself with it in the room in front of the mirror. He had never thought he had the world's dullest face, a thoroughly forgettable face with a look of docility that he could not understand, and a look also of vague fright that he had never been able to erase. A real conformist's face, he thought. The cap changed all that. It gave him a country air. Greenwich, Connecticut, country. Now he was a young man with a private income. Not long out of Princeton, perhaps. He bought a pipe to go with the cap. He was starting a new life. Goodbye to all the second-rate people he had hung around, and he let hang around him in the past 3 years in New York. He felt as he imagined immigrants felt when they left everything behind them in some foreign country, left their friends and relations and their past mistakes, and sailed for America. A clean slate. Whatever happened with Dickie, he would acquit himself well, and Mr. Greenleaf would know that he had, and would respect him for it. When Mr. Greenleaf's money was used up, he might not come back to America. He might get an interesting job in a hotel, for instance, where they needed somebody bright and personable who spoke English. Or he might become a representative for some European firm and travel everywhere in the world. Or somebody might come along who needed a young man exactly like himself, who could drive a car, who was quick at figures, who could entertain an old grandmother or squire, somebody's daughter, to a dance. He was versatile. And the world was wide. He swore to himself he would stick to a job once he got it. Patience and perseverance. Upwards and onward. "Have you Henry James, the ambassador?" Tom asked the officer in charge of the first-class library. The book was not on the shelf. "I'm sorry, we haven't, sir," said the officer. Tom was disappointed. It was a book Mr. Greenleaf had asked him if he had read. Tom felt he ought to read it. He went to the cabin-class library. He found the book on the shelf, and when he started to check it out and gave his cabin number, the attendant told him, sorry, the first-class passengers were not allowed to take books from the cabin-class library. Tom had been afraid of that. He put the book back docilely, though it would have been easy, so easy to make a pass at the shelf and slip the book under his jacket. In the mornings he strolled several times around the deck, but very slowly, so that the people puffing around on their morning constitutionals always passed him 2 or 3 times before he had been around once, then settled down in his deck chair for bullion and more thought on his own destiny. After lunch, he pottered around in his cabin, basking in its privacy and comfort, doing absolutely nothing. Sometimes he sat in the writing room, thoughtfully penning letters on the ship's stationery to Mark Primiger, to Cleo, to the Greenleafs. The letter to the Greenleafs began as a polite greeting and a thank you for the bon voyage basket and the comfortable accommodations, but he amused himself by adding an imaginary post-dated paragraph about finding Dickie and living with him in his Mongebello house, about the slow but steady progress he was making in persuading Dickie to come home, about the swimming, the fishing, the cafe life, and he got so carried away that it went on for 8 to 10 pages. pages, and he knew he would never mail any of it. So he wrote on about Dickie not being romantically interested in Marge. He gave a complete character analysis of Marge, so it was not Marge who was holding Dickie, thought Mrs. Greenleaf. He thought it might be, until the table was covered with sheets of paper and the first call came for dinner. On another afternoon, he wrote a polite note to Aunt Dotty. Dear Aunt Dotty, which he rarely called her in a letter, and never to her face. As you see by the stationery, I am on the high seas, an unexpected business offer which I cannot explain now. I had to leave rather suddenly, so I was not able to get up to Boston, and I'm sorry because it may be months or even years before I come back. I just wanted you to know not to worry and not to send me any more checks, thank you. Thank you very much for the last one a month or so ago. I don't suppose you have sent any more since then. I am well and extremely happy. Love, Tom. No use sending any good wishes about her health. She was as strong as an ox. He added, P.S. I have no idea what my address will be, so I cannot give you any. That made him feel better, because it definitely cut him off from her. He needn't ever tell her where he was. No more of the snidey digging letters, the sly comparisons of him to his father, the piddling checks for the strange sums of $6.48 and $12.95, as if she had a bit left over from her last bill paying, or taken something back to a store and had tossed the money to him like a crumb. Considering what Aunt Dotty might have sent him with her income, the checks were an insult. Aunt Dotty insisted that his upbringing had cost her more than his father had left in insurance, and maybe it had, but did she have to keep rubbing it in his face? Did any human being keep rubbing a thing like this in a child's face? Lots of aunts, even strangers, raised a child for nothing and were delighted to do it. After his letter to Aunt Dotty, he got up and strode around the deck, walking it off. Writing her always made him feel angry. He resented the courtesy to her. Yet until now he had always wanted her to know where he was, because he had always needed her piddling checks. He had to write a score of letters about his change of addresses to Auntie Dotty, but he didn't need her money now. He would hold himself independent of it, forever. He thought suddenly of one summer day when he had been about 12, when he had been on a cross-country trip with Aunt Dotty and a woman friend of hers, and they had got stuck in a bumper traffic jam somewhere. It had been a hot summer day, and Aunt Dotty had sent him out with the thermos to get some ice water at a filling station, and suddenly the traffic had started moving. He remembered running between huge inches of cars, always about to touch the door of Aunt Dotty's car, had never been quite able to do, because she had kept inching along as fast as she could go, not willing to wait for him a minute, and yelling, come on, you damn slowpoke, out the window all the time. When he had finally made it to the car and got in, with tears of frustration and anger running down his cheek, she had said gaily to her friends, oh, sissy, he's a sissy from the ground up, just like his father. It was a wonder he had emerged from such treatment as well as he had. And just what, he wondered, made Aunt Dotty think his father had been a sissy? Had she ever cited a single thing? No. Lying in his deck chair, fortified morally by the luxurious surroundings and inwardly by the abundance of well-prepared food, he tried to take an objective look at his past life. The last 4 years had been, for the most part, a waste. There was no denying it. A series of haphazard jobs, long perilous intervals with no job at all, and consequent demoralization because of having no money, and then taking up with stupid, silly people in order not to be lonely, or because they could offer him something for a while, as Mark Primiger had. It was not a record to be proud of, considering he had come to New York with such high aspirations. He had wanted to be an actor, though at 20 he had not had the faintest idea of the difficulties, the necessary training, or even the necessary talent. He had thought he had the necessary talent, and all he would have to do was show a producer a few of his original one-man skits. Mrs. Roosevelt writing My Day after a visit to a clinic for unmarried mothers, for instance. But the first 3 rebuffs had killed all his courage and his hope. He had no reserve or money, so he had taken the job on the banana boat, which at least had removed him from New York. He had been afraid that Aunt Dottie had called the police to look for him in New York, though he hadn't done anything wrong in Boston, just run off to make his own way in the world as millions of young men had done before him. His main mistake had been that he had never stuck to anything, he thought, like the accounting job in the department store that might have worked into something if he had not been so completely discouraged by the slowness of department store promotions. Well, he blamed Aunt Dottie to some extent for his lack of perseverance, never giving him credit when he was young for anything he had stuck to, like his paper route when he was 13. He had won a silver medal from the newspaper for courtesy, service, and reliability. It was like looking back at another person to remember himself then, a skinny, sniveling wretch with an eternal cold in the nose, who had still managed to win a medal for courtesy, service, and reliability. Aunt Dottie had hated him when he had a cold. She used to take her handkerchief and nearly retch his nose off, wiping it. Tom wreathed in the deck chairs as he thought of it, but he wreathed elegantly, adjusting the crease in his trousers. He remembered the vow he had made, even at the age of 8, to run away from Aunt Dottie, the violent scenes he had imagined. Aunt Dottie trying to hold him in the house, and he hitting him with her fists, flinging her to the ground, and throttling her, and Folly tearing the big brooch off her dress, and stabbing her a million times in the throat with it. He had run away at 17, and been brought back, and he had done it again at 20. And succeeded. And it was astounding and pitiful how naive he had been, how little he had known about the ways of the world, as if he had spent so much of that time hating Aunt Dottie and scheming how to escape her that he had not had enough time to learn and grow. He remembered the way he had felt when he had been fired from the warehouse job during his first months in New York. He had held the job less than 2 weeks because he hadn't been strong enough to lift orange crates 8 hours a day. But he had done his best at knocking himself out trying to hold the job, and when they had fired him, he remembered how horribly unjust he had thought it was. He remembered deciding then that the world was full of Simon Legrees, and that you had to be an animal, as tough as the gorillas who worked with him at the warehouse, or starve. He remembered that right after that he had stolen a loaf of bread from a delicatessen counter and had taken it home and devoured it, feeling the world owed him a loaf of bread to him, and more. Mr. Ripley, one of the English women who sat on the sofa with him in the lounge the other day during tea, was bending over him. "We were wondering if you cared to join us in the rubber bridge in the game room. We're going to start in about 15 minutes. Tom said politely in his chair. "Thank you very much, but I think I prefer to stay outside. Besides, I'm not good at bridge." "Oh, neither are we. All right, another time," she smiled and went away. Tom sank back in his chair again, pulled the cap down over his eyes, and folded his hands over his wrist. His aloofness, he knew, was causing a little comment among the passengers. He had not danced with either of the silly girls who kept looking at him hopefully and giggling during the after-dinner dance every night. He imagined the speculations of the passengers. Is he an American? I think so, but he doesn't act like an American, does he? Most Americans are so noisy. He's terribly serious, isn't he? He can't be more than 23. He must have something very important on his mind. Yes, he had. The present and the future of Tom Ripley.